starting off for chapter 14, we have just two concepts here that are worth getting right. We have the idea of an instance and we have the idea of static members. Now, these are located beginning on page 815, and while there are many pages of support here, really, I think the concepts here boil down to two different ways to look at the way it is that we manage our classes and objects. The first idea here is an instance. Now, an instance is what happens when you have a new object of a class. It is referred to as an instance. So if we have a student class, for example, and that student class would have public and private member variables and member functions that belong to it. So you would have student ID, you would have student last name, student first name, student address, blah, 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 blah. Things of that nature. And for each time it is that we create a new object of that student class, what we're doing is we're creating a new instance of that object. Now, for each instance that we create, we also have instance variables. So the specific version of this class that exists as this object has this instance of a student ID, this instance of a student first name, this instance of a member function. So things like get or set student first name, get or set student last name. So the real driving factor for the idea of instance existing here in this chapter is a little bit of a foreshadowing to what we see a little bit later on. You'll notice I kept using this like it was a keyboard. This instance of student ID, this student first name, this get first name. There's a reason for that, and we're going to use this as a keyword again. And now, one of the things we did not do when we were doing the refresher at the beginning of the course was go back and take a look at this. And the reason for that was, number one, I knew we would come back to it here. And number two, we used it in a really very, very shallow way all the way back in chapter 3 when referring to a variable. And frankly, it was artificial the way we did it there. When we use the this keyword here in chapter 14, it will be, in a way that much more closely resembles how it is that you would use it in a stand-up development somewhere down the road. So that is the idea here of an instance of a class or an object. Now, if we go to page, and this is 819, a little further along, we have the idea of a static member of a class. Now, the important thing about a static member is that it doesn't necessarily belong to any particular instance of a class. It doesn't actually belong to any particular object there. It belongs to the class itself. And as a matter of fact, you don't even need to have an instance of the class instantiated in order for you to be able to access the static members of a class. So all in all, what does that mean? So if we go back and look at our student class example that we've been using for a couple of chapters now, and we think about how many students are there. Now, that's not something that I want to belong to a particular instance of student, right? Even though it's true that you have a student ID, and it is also probably true that the student ID is a simple incrementation of a number, right? So we start on some number someplace, and when student next is instantiated, we just add 1 to the previous student ID, and then we assign it to that student. But what we don't really want is number of students to be associated with each and every new student that we create, right? Because you, as a student, give no care about how many students there were that existed before you. The problem with having you have number of students as a variable is that's not something that we can keep updated for you necessarily, right? Because the moment it is that you're done registering for a class, another student does it too. And if you've been here for a year or 2 years, by the time it is you take C++ Advanced, it's probably been a year and a half or so. And there's going to be, hundreds of students that are instantiated after you. So number of students doesn't belong to a particular instance of a student. It belongs to the class. Now, there's a couple of things that are worth noting about static members. They can be variables like number of students, and they can be functions like increment number of students, and they don't belong to anybody, so any object in particular. The other thing to notice about a static member of a class is remember the way that C++ during compile before runtime goes about looking at your header files. It creates that object before running, for us, what would be main.cpp. So these objects, they're not objects, right? They are classes. These classes exist in memory before we even run the program. So the life of a static member of a class is not the life of the object. Because remember, we can create objects, we can create classes of objects, we can create arrays of objects, rather, and we can destroy them too. So that is, anathema to the idea of static. It's the opposite of what we're looking at there, right? So a static member does not survive so long as there are instances of that class. A static member survives in memory as long as the program is being run. So those are the important takeaways here from 14.1. An instance is a one of, this particular one of a class, whatever it is that we're referring to. And we're going to start referring to it as this, right? The very same way that we do in English. This mouse. How do I know it's not any other mouse that exists out there? I already said, because it's this one. So that's the key word that we are looking at here. The other idea here is a static member, something that belongs to a class, something that does not belong to any particular instance of a class, and something that lives not as long as an object does, but as long as the program is running.